Here is your WESN news on the hour. I'm Naomi Macnish. Thanks for joining us. Here are the headlines. Special branch officer nominated for police commissioner post. Scotiabank has reported an after-tax profit of $340 million. 5 held and 2 firearms seized in exercises. And internationally, Trump claims rare earth deal done with China. Now for the details. The House of Representatives will debate a motion to appoint Alistair Guevara as the new Commissioner of Police on June 13th. This information is contained in a motion on the House's order paper for that sitting. The motion said the PSC has submitted Guevara's name for appointment to the office of Commissioner of Police. The President issued this notification on May 9th, and the motion states it is expedient to approve the notification. Guevara, who was last assigned to the special branch, was part of the 3-man investigative team appointed to February 2022 island-wide blackout in Trinidad. Guevara studied law enforcement leadership at the International Law Enforcement Academy, San Salvador, El Salvador. The motion also calls on the House to approve the notification of Assistant Commissioner of Police Wayne Meister to act as a DCP. This notification was issued by the President on June 3rd. Scotiabank Trinidad and Tobago Limited has reported a profit after tax of $340 million for its 6 months ended April 30th, 2025. In a release, the group stated that this represents an increase of $17 million or 5% over the same period last year. Income after tax for the second quarter was $174 million, an increase of $14 million or 9% over the prior quarter's performance. This improved profitability resulted in an increased return on equity of 14.9% and a stable return on assets of 2.2% over the prior year, the bank stated. Based on these financial results, the bank has declared a dividend of 70 cents per share for the second quarter, for a total of 140 cents for the first half of fiscal 2025. 5 persons were arrested and 2 firearms seized by officers during anti-crime exercises conducted in the Northern, Eastern, and Southern Divisions Tuesday, 10th of June. In the Eastern Division, officers of the Manzanilla Police Post conducted an exercise around 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday, 10th of June 2025, during which they arrested 2 men for being in possession of a pistol loaded with a magazine containing 15 rounds of ammunition. Meanwhile, in the Northern Division, officers of the Maloney Police Station conducted an exercise between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Wednesday, 11th of June 2025. During the exercise, the officers proceeded to an apartment building in the district where they found 1 pistol and 9 rounds of ammunition. And in the Princestown district, officers conducted a strategic intelligence-led exercise between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. on the 10th of June. The operation led to the arrest of a 29-year-old San Fernando man for larceny, a 31-year-old Princestown man from wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and a 45-year-old man of Lair Village for breach of protection order. Investigations are ongoing into all matters. Internationally, talks aimed at cooling tensions between the U.S. and China have ended in a deal, according to U.S. President Donald Trump. He said China had agreed to supply U.S. companies with magnets and rare earth metals, while the U.S. would walk back its threats to revoke visas of Chinese students. It followed 2 days of intense talks in London to resolve conflicts that had emerged since the two sides agreed a truce in May, after a rapid escalation of tariffs had nearly paralyzed trade between the world's 2 largest economies. Well, that's news to the hour on WESN. I'm Naomi Macnish. Thanks for watching.
WESN. one question over the whole saga that to some extent one could actually say maybe it's not that important, at least not anymore given the potential resolution. But the biggest question that was left hanging was just who was the individual national that the Venezuelan authorities claimed to have arrested and have in custody. And it seems as though one media house has been able to figure it out. I believe perhaps a fishing community has reached out, or they were able to track it down, a gentleman by the name of Gis Kendall Jeron, not Jerome. So it does make sense to some extent that perhaps not fully understanding cross-culturally what the actual name was. A man that seemingly they have varying opinions of by members of his community and by his family. Some call him simply a fisherman. Some say he was involved essentially in things like smuggling, right? Of course, he hasn't been convicted, so it's just the perception of people involved. Some people think if you want stuff moved across the border, he's the man to contact, things like that. And apparently he has technically already run afoul of the criminal underworld in the past. And also his family has, to some extent, distanced themselves from him. What does that all suggest? Keyword suggest. It suggests that he was involved in smuggling. So you could easily see where the local national was involved with somebody wanting to cross the border to do something. Most likely some kind of criminal activity, right? Human trafficking, or even just taking goods from TNT across the border to sell in Venezuela, right? Of course, it could be drugs, could be guns, maybe he was going to bring stuff back, right? Who knows? And for whatever reason, he was pinched by Venezuelan authorities who then turned it into the claim of a plot to destabilize Venezuela. Because that's one of the things that the people who believe to know him, they themselves cannot believe. They find it's a bridge too far to think that the person that they know, who they call Ambrose, is a terrorist. I think to some extent, somebody says he wasn't no kingpin, and I doubt he trying to overthrow any government. Now, to be fair, and this is literally saying something not because I believe it is true, but because the possibility exists. If you're doing some sort of clandestine operation, some of the people that you're going to, whose services you're going to utilize, are going to be people who are completely unaware of who you are, what you do, and they're just going to be low-level people on the ground, so you can get things done. So there's a chance that in his boat, if it was his boat, I assume it would have been his boat, there could have been American journalists, American confidential informants, American spies, American undercover law enforcement officials, although at the very least, that last one, I kind of doubt. But it's not impossible, right? Like I said, it could have been spies. It could have been agents of the American spy services, or it could have been people working for the American spy services, because actual spies are not CIA officers. Spies are people recruited, usually people who are actually indigenous to the area that you're trying to get the espionage work done. That's why all arrested spies in America are actually American nationals when you look at it, right? That's how it's. The Soviets didn't actually go in and take the pictures. They got someone to do that for them. They compromised someone. And maybe that's what, this was some sort of espionage or law enforcement or undercover or what have you. Or it could have been something more nefarious, who knows, right? Technically speaking, we have no idea. It's just that while possible, it is possible for a rock to literally come from space and fall right on top of Nicolas Maduro's head. Do we expect that to happen? No. It's possible for gold, because from what I understand, and I'm not a geologist, so don't quote me on this, gold technically is not a mineral indigenous to Earth. A big, huge asteroid of gold could just land in the savannah, right? And assuming it doesn't wipe us out, it could enrich us for 2 decades. Not going to happen. All we know is that apparently somebody involved in illegal activity with regards to crossing the border illegally and moving stuff, whether contraband, everyday goods, or people, he was pinched. We haven't even necessarily gotten proper confirmation from the Venezuelan authorities. For all we know, they killed everybody, and that's why they haven't shown them on TV. In which case, then, it's to some extent an international incident because he was potentially killed without any due process of the law. To be fair, though, it's not as though TNT has never done that with far more innocent victims. Whether intentionally or not is besides the point, because in this case, I would imagine it would have been unintentional, or at least I hope. So one aspect of this whole scenario, we at least have a clue. Technically, it's not guaranteed. It's just because the names line up. It is believed that this gentleman, who is no big player in international or transnational crime, much less a terrorist mastermind, or seemingly there would be no indications of why a local fisherman / smuggler would be looking to try to overthrow a government of a nation with 20 to 30 million in population. Yeah, that seems like something he would do on any given Friday. So we have to wait and see how this continues, because I do believe ultimately that yes, and this confirms to me at least part of what I think, keyword there, think happened. Somebody was crossing the border illegally, as they usually do, to smuggle or transport whatever they usually transport, and for whatever reason, Venezuela decided to make this an issue. Maybe it was a Colombian plot to smuggle in somebody to do something. Who knows? Doubt that one activity was going to overthrow the Maduro regime, because if you understand how dictatorships work, it's going to take a lot more than that. But it makes me think the whole dog and pony show of we caught this and blah, 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 blah was essentially someone from the Maduro administration basically saying, this is who to blame for our problems, blame them, we will deal with them. It's the most basic political bait and switch of all time. Don't blame us because we're not the enemy, they are the enemy, even if the threat is potentially non-existent and so minuscule it really doesn't matter. But hey, we have technically speaking, we potentially have a national of TNT being held potentially on an improper basis. Let's put it that way. Now, moving on before we go into the daily review, there has been 2 names put forward to be debated in Parliament with regards to both a new Deputy Commissioner of Police and a new Commissioner of Police. So right now, the person that is under consideration for Commissioner of Police is an acting Senior Superintendent, Alastair Guevara, which is interesting because potentially it kind of, at least to some extent, goes against the commentary we got publicly a few months ago from both then Prime Minister Stuart Young and the head of the Police Service Commission with regards to the pool of candidates that it could select for the post of Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner. So, I mean, Senior Superintendent is, I believe, just under Assistant Commissioner of Police, but even the head of the Service Commission said, you know, we would like to select the candidates for ACPs because then we would have better control on the pool of candidates for the higher ranks. All right. But for whatever reason, they have gone underneath. This is in part due to the fact that the government doesn't want to take the time to change the process now. They need to put a commissioner in now, because right now we just have an acting commissioner, and to some extent that's not proper, which is an indictment on the whole situation with Stephen Williams, just saying, and how he was kind of left dangling as acting. But they also are looking to move ahead and I believe make ACP Meister a Deputy Commissioner of Police. I'm not entirely sure if it was revealed what would be the portfolio of the new DCP if he goes ahead. Now, the candidate for Commissioner of Police apparently is an experienced police officer and is in special branch. So, to some extent, it's a serious unit that has been involved in high-profile cases. His experience may or may not prepare him for a lot of the challenges that the current executive seemingly, they kind of fall flat on their face. One of the things is, because he is at a lower level, my very generic hope that has actually no real basis in fact, it's just an assumption or a hypothesis, is that given the generation that he is in, and we've seen the media ambassadors from, most of them are rank or so lower than him, but we've seen the media ambassadors be able to handle themselves in media to some extent a lot better than the police executive. One would hope that he potentially similarly could handle public speaking and presentations and interviews to that extent better than what we've seen in the immediate past. McDonald Jacobs wasn't bad, Gary Griffith wasn't bad, of course. The most recent substantive commissioner of police was not so hot. Junior Benjamin, not too sure, don't really have an opinion on his abilities, because in part, we haven't necessarily kind of see him face some of the same kind of tests that Euler has, to be fair to Euler. But he should have the experience as a police officer, as a field officer, hopefully in investigations and high-profile matters, etc., how to deal with those critical things, how to deal with high-ranking people who may or may not be involved in whatever, working with high-ranking people. If he has the communication ability, well, that's basically 2 out of the 3 or 4 key areas of skills that you want from your police commissioner. There's still also administration, handling promotions, disciplinary actions, etc., etc. If he's too gung-ho of a field officer, he might not necessarily be great as an administrator. However, the question, of course, is what do we need more of? Because you're not guaranteed to get somebody who's good at everything. And you could always delegate administrative tasks, potentially. A lot easier than delegating leadership functions, which you need actual hard experience doing the job and actual ability to communicate and be in front of the press and be in front of the public and be in front of the troops. Yes, police officers, but I use the word troops loosely. And to be able to face scrutiny and to handle certain difficult conversations with grace and to back up your officers when appropriate and to, if necessary, discipline them. And if you could do those things, then some of the administrative stuff, you could delegate that. Because right now we have hard issues with the police service dealing with crime in the field, arguably are more pressing than cleaning up administrative stuff within the service, which one wonders if some of those things were there, not so much because of anything inherently wrong with the service, but because of the direction, the vision and mission, or lack thereof, of the previous commissioner. Because some of those things, we didn't hear about them happening to that extent under her 2 predecessors. Let me just say it like that. So this is one of the things on the agenda of Parliament. To some extent, though, he's an unknown publicly, so one criminologist has pointed that out. It's to be debated. I believe a merit list, an order of merit has not necessarily been provided, so we don't know. It's just that his name apparently is being up for consideration. It's been submitted to the president. So it's expected, pointed out by the administration, that the president will then lawfully pass it on. So we have to see how this whole situation unfolds. And perhaps to some extent this goes back to the sentiment of we need fresh blood in the executive. It's difficult to potentially, even though Junior Benjamin himself might not have been directly responsible for a lot of the things that went wrong, it might be guilt by association, but sometimes it's difficult to change the course of an organization if you have holdovers, even if the holdovers were mostly innocent of all of the inefficiencies and lack of results. It's just one of those dynamics of any organization when if you turn over the ship, it's a lot more apparent and immediate to the rank and file that, A, there's a heavy expectation for change. Don't think you could continue doing everything that you were doing that potentially also contributed to the problems. And that might be unfair to acting Commissioner Benjamin, but some people would go so far as to remove him altogether. I don't know if that's necessary. Is he the best candidate for commissioner? There are arguments for it, but I do believe ultimately fresh blood into the role as commissioner might be better, because we need change for the sake of change is not always a good idea, but sports fans will know sometimes your team needs change, and as much as there are situations where you kind of go off half-cocked and you pull the plug too soon, there are other situations where you try to maintain stability and continuity to a fault. And maybe this is one of those situations where we need to break continuity, at least in some ways and in some capacities. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll go into the daily review, a lot of stuff to get through. Of course, there's been a couple of days of flooding. I haven't necessarily spoken about what actually happened just yet, and more. Stay tuned. This is Talking About the WSN show. Michael Small didn't say hello at the top of the show. I apologize to the one viewer who pointed that out. But we'll be right back after this. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Claudette, radiographer at the radiology departments at the community hospital. We offer high-quality service with state-of-the-art equipment in X-ray, ultrasound, CT, and mammogram. Come, our friendly staff awaits you.
Give us a call at 235-5479.
The Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
Where good private health care is affordable.
Low energy? Heart concerns? Migraines slowing you down? It's time to take control of your health. Join Wellness Unlocked, the series that brings expert advice and real solutions for a healthier you. In our latest episode, learn how Jameson CoQ10 can help support heart health, boost energy, and even reduce migraines. Get the science, the stories, and the steps to power up your health with CoQ10. Don't miss Wellness Unlocked. Watch now on WESN and start your wellness journey today.
Bill and Ruth fell in love with the Benjamin Moore color Dry Sage, but they tried to match it using another brand's paint.
I mean, it's close enough.
Almost identical, really. Yeah, there it is.
Never trust another paint to be a Benjamin Moore color.
Take some time for yourself or spend some time with the family at Sandy Point Village Hotel. Enjoy our various studio and suite apartments, self-contained with their own kitchenettes and Wi-Fi. We also have our famous 100-foot swimming pool and our beachfront restaurant, the Steak and Lobster Grill. And our location in Crown Point puts us near the center of activity from the nylon pool to the local nightlife. Call us and make your reservations at 639-8533, 389-2378, or email us at sandypointvillagehotel@gmail.com.
Of course, for the last couple of days, we've had heavy rains, and now we're in a situation where we already had flood, well, to some extent, the orange level alert yesterday with regards to the Caribbean River Basin, and we've already seen flooding across the country. It has left some communities especially concerned. There's a news report with regards to the residents of St. Helena that they're on edge. They're looking at the experience of 2018, and they're hoping that it has not come to pass, because for me and where I live, The rain hasn't been particularly heavy. It's been overcast quite a bit. You know, there have been consistent rains. So far, of course, I have avoided, I believe, the worst of it, but that is not necessarily the case where there are parts of the country where people are concerned with regards to the level of rain, the level of floods, the damage that has been done to property, the damage that has been done to foliage, and of course, the blockages with regards to our drainage situation and what have you. So, you know, the community of St. Helena, they're looking at that. Also, one of, I guess, my social media followers on my personal account, similar situation for Caroni, also looking at 2018. The uploader is monitoring community chats. Water is crossing into the roundabouts, crossed by the TT post, so the water levels are potentially rising, or it's steadily rising, that they said. And it's just one of those things where, to some of us, you know, be looking at our homes, yes, it's overcast, yes, it's raining, so, you know, you have to be more careful when you're driving out, but you're not necessarily thinking that it's any sort of emergency. And it's just one of those we're not America where, you know, you have some national emergency like wildfires in California, and you're there on the East Coast, you know, just saying, oh my gosh, how bad is that for people so far away? We're a very, very, very small country. And the fact that we have parts of the country that is under this level of stress and strain, when other parts are not, to some extent, is quite concerning to me, because I think it's very easy for a lot of the rest of us to overlook what's going on for those people that have to deal with the kind of flooding where, in the report in St. Helena, I think they were talking about utilizing blocks or bricks to kind of try to, I know in the States, I'm not too sure about here, there are situations where people would build walls essentially to keep the water off of their property, because the water level will be far above the ground level of their property, so they'll have to build walls, have an extra expense, potentially, you know, raise everything. To what extent can you, do you have the capacity to spend that money? And if you're talking about, like one person said, raise your appliances in your own home. So right now, I believe even today, the Met Office, they have released a yellow level alert, once again for the whole Trinidad and Tobago. And the thing is, the yellow level alert makes it very likely to have heavy rains. Not necessarily very likely to have significant damage because of those rains, right? Whereas yesterday, the orange level alert for Caroni, it made it very likely for, not the most likely on their chart. They have a little chart. Maybe next time I'll get the chart to show you. But the point is, heavy rains across the country are very likely. And I would argue at that point, while there's always a chance that hopefully the remaining potential rain clouds might leave us mostly unscathed, given the fact that it's covering the entire nation, every location is rolling the dice. And even if the odds are good, we just need a bad roll to come up once or twice throughout the country for us to have another disaster. Now, the Education Ministry is looking at flood risk and school safety and if they keep kids at home or not and all of that. And that, of course, complicates life a lot more, because if the children have to stay home, then what do the parents do? And this is one of the unfortunate realities of modern living 2025, dual income households being more of a necessity than a perk or a luxury. And again, to what extent is this affecting certain areas more than others, right? Because of course they're looking at riverine levels, flood-prone areas, and so far, with regards to the response by the government, right? I don't think people necessarily have an issue so far. Of course, local government minister Khadija Amin has been quite visible and vocal, at least to some extent. There have been issues with flash flooding, trees being down, water treatment plants are affected, and I think this is some of the things somebody within that field did tell me, and it was a surprise when he told me, so it's not a surprise to me now, but I would imagine for a lot of people who don't necessarily realize, in the immediate term, heavy rains for water reservoirs is not a good thing. So the question is to what extent, because the Minister of Local Government just was involved in an event which highlighted the fact that efforts were being done with regards to have measures in place with regards to assistance and natural disaster planning for disabled people on top of everything else. And now, to some extent, we're kind of seeing maybe some of those initiatives kind of bear fruit, but I don't think anybody expected it to be so soon. Right now, the government is operating with loan financing to deal with a deficit just with the month of May. We're in June, so I'm not entirely sure what their plans were. I don't know if they told us what their plans were to finance June, or if they had enough money, because I think May was costing $4 billion. Or at least the bill at the deficit might have rose to $4 billion because salaries alone was $2 billion. So, to what extent will the efforts by the local government minister and other ministers, would we have the finances to continue with it? That is my fear, and it's not a fear that the administration will not be able to do anything and it's their fault. No, it's just the literal practical reality of, do we have enough money to deal with this? And it goes back to something that I said yesterday when I kind of mentioned this topic. I am not affected regularly enough by floods that I need significant, I want to see significant resources spent in my area to deal with flooding. Not to say that it, you know, where I live can't flood out, it can. But one of the things that I think, as someone who is not as affected as others, I have no issue with resources potentially being diverted from national programs or whatever other areas earmarked for expenditure and be diverted for flood mitigation and to improve our drainage and catchment in flood-prone areas. Because one of the things that I have not necessarily seen yet, and maybe I just missed it, is improvement with regards to new reservoirs and new canals, not just box drains next to roads, but I'm talking about, if not widening rivers and increasing the size of rivers, basically cutting new canals in areas where feasible, in order to try to have someplace else for the water to go. And again, then of course, consideration could be given, if planned in the long term, for those canals, those large drainage projects to lead into reservoirs that could then be utilized to help alleviate water supply issues when we have the extra rainwater, because it's not necessarily guaranteed that we'll always have heavy rains on a regular schedule. Of course, one of the other ministers who has been on the ground even before, and I've been told this, so this is key. This is not the, oh, something happened and we get the dog and pony show, you know, being rolled out for us for some photo opportunities, right? To be fair to the administration, Works and Infrastructure Minister Jolene John, she has also been on the ground. She's pointing out widespread dumping of waste in watercourses as a national emergency, which to some extent it probably is, but again, I would like to highlight, as her peer, her counterpart did, we can't just limit ourselves to that. But the sad reality is, while I'm saying we can't just limit ourselves to that, if this low-hanging fruit is still going on, and it speaks to more than just now, think about it. It speaks to the fact that, one, we have far too many people who are more than willing to litter. And that's a wider problem, because we want to be a tourist destination, and we want more cruise ships arrivals, and we want more people to enjoy the beauty of the island. And the beauty of the island will include how many styrofoam containers and soft drink bottles, and plastic forks, and plastic corks, and plastic straws, and plastic, and even the paper soft drink cups that you get from restaurants and fast food outlets. There's wax lining to make it waterproof. To what extent does that make it difficult to break down? And then, of course, there are larger items being dumped. If you go on the ferry, at least when I was regularly on the ferry, the inter-island ferry, and you just look out in the port of Port of Spain, you know, the same port where the cruise ships' arrivals comes, you would just see, rhetorically speaking, a ton of trash in the water. And now it's not going to be the cleanest water in the world, but why does it have to have so much plastic debris? And of course, that also speaks to our just how we deal with our environment and the cleanliness of our own environment, of where we live, and the safety of our own environment. And I get it. They have communities with sewage exposure to the open air problems, etc., etc. But we should still be doing our part. Then, of course, is the fact that people just don't care about their fellow citizens that have to deal with the floodwaters when their refuse blocks watercourses. And what does that say about us? Right? Pollution is a major contributor to flooding across the country. In addition to major appliances, we have plastic bottles strewn everywhere throughout our water systems. And the thing is, you might not throw it in a river, but it might end up in a river. Because you throw it on the street, you know, then the rain comes, it washes it into a drain, the drain goes into a canal, and there you go. And Minister John is pointing out, I'm hoping that people will be civil-minded and responsible enough not to dump waste. And again, I just have a problem with this whole situation where, because they're pointing out, I think, to the report in Freeport where, you know, when it rains too heavily, millions of dollars from that community might be lost with regards to damages. So we're not talking about, oh, you know, we're blocking the drains and a little water spills out on your road and people are inconvenienced. We're talking about the fact that this is affecting people's lives in a very real way. And the minister has to come and point out the obvious. It's like basically, it's on the level of telling a primary school student, don't hit your classmate. But you're giving that level of message to adults. Because you can't tell me all the pollution is because of primary school kids. So the other thing is, and this is what we need to understand, to remedy all of these things also costs money. Clearing out rivers would also include things like silt buildup and just natural sediment, etc., right? Depending. So just the natural course of rivers, you know, you might have to clear out dirt and whatnot. Depending on when trees collapse and so many logs fall into the river, you have to clear that out too, because then that will cause an impediment that could help debris accumulate there. It could all be natural debris. It doesn't have to be pollution. But then on top of that, you add to the problem with pollution, and that costs money to clean. Money that otherwise could have been used in other things. So part of it too is, not just is there callousness to say, hey, I don't care about whoever deals with flooding, I want to just dump my trash wherever I feel like it because I'm a grown man and I don't have any consideration as an adult. I don't have any common sense as an adult. I don't have any maturity as an adult. I'll just dump my trash wherever because I'm a big man and nobody could tell me what to do. But why can't the government pay for this thing that I need? Well, some of that money went to clean up your mess. Government is not mother and father where they do things for free. They can't. In this case. Oh yes, whenever we get free things from the government, we think it's free, but it's not free. Someone has to pay for that. When your parent cleans up after you in your house, it's still taking time out of their day. Technically speaking, that time costs money, but we don't actually have to put a dollar value to it. But when the government does something, it's never free. So of course, certain areas, I believe yesterday was already, or rather Tuesday, was already hit with flooding, water, of course, spilling out into the roadway, rivers rising, certain communities being hit. We have to kind of wait and see how this all unfolds now today. Again, I guess this is the third day. It potentially, if it continues like how we did this morning, dare I say, could it be potentially the worst? I believe the yellow level alert is up until 4 p.m. South Trinidad is also on alert with regards to the threat of flooding, just generally speaking. You know, local government services in certain communities are out, and they've pointed to the fact that the current administration they've seen a better response, and that's kind of sad. I want to get the correct quote here. I just want to get the correct quote here. There's a lot of different stories that I'm reading through, so to try and find it. Also, with regards to one regional corporation, they're talking about landowners who have blocked watercourses. That's the other thing with town and country planning. So not only do we have the fact that, hey, people are building on hills, people are building in flood-prone areas, but also blocking up watercourses. So at least one local government chairman, this is from Penal Davie Regional Corporation, he's pointing the fact recent watercourse clearance projects with reducing the severity of the current flooding. So they are making notes. I can't find the story that basically points to the fact that the response has been potentially different this time around. I believe we have a comment, so let me take a look at that before we move on. If you could just put it up on my screen, we'll just take the comment right now. The Diana River ready to burst its bank. That's in Chase Village, where I live in Edinburgh, South 500. Don't flood, but my relatives live in Chase Village. Yeah, that's just another area. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of stories like that. Part of it is, of course, because we've had consistent rain over the last 3 days, certain areas, the question will not be the severity of heavy rains quickly, but rather just the accumulation of the volume of water over the last 3 days. And again, the yellow level alert at least should be for the rest of today. And then, of course, essentially the Met Service has been making these pronouncements seemingly on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know if maybe, later today by 4 p.m., 6 p.m., we'll get a warning that, the yellow level alert might be extended into tonight, into tomorrow morning, and so on and so on. So let me just leave this story there and move on. I can't find the quote that I was hoping for, but maybe I misread it. Next story up that I wanted to touch to today is with regards to the whole situation and one story in particular pointed this out, the politicization or politicizing of school violence. Now, to some extent, a lot of issues were politicized by the then UNC opposition within the last several years, right? It's just one of those things where once the opposition starts speaking about it, it's kind of going to become political, whether warranted or not. So the question, of course, you have to ask yourself is that the case in this situation? Because now we've reached the point where, to be fair to critics, the Prime Minister is technically taking a far more extreme position on the situation, an extreme position that the previous administration seemingly did not necessarily want to go to. The opposition leader basically, and this is a few days ago, they was asking the Prime Minister on the specific measures to reduce school violence. And to some extent, what is, and this is in the headline of that story, what is the plan for the errant pupils? Because as we've mentioned before, I believe last week, Friday, with Ashraf Ali, you can't just expel them and leave them to their own devices. So, but to some extent now, the opposition leaders quoted comment, it is clear that violent students must either be rehabilitated or removed from the school system. To some extent, that seems not necessarily a criticism of the administration, but in line with what the stated agenda of how to, or policy shift on how to deal with this situation is. Because again, when you kind of listen to the press conference on one of the latest incidents of violence, it seems kind of graphic and significantly way beyond anything I've experienced personally with regards to the damage inflicted on one female student. Now, of course, the former Minister of Education, Dr. Nan Gatsby-Dolly, she's pointing out I guess you could say she's to some extent having to defend her previous track record. And that's being called out with regards to some of the comments being made. So now we've reached the point where it's gone beyond, and this is where it gets a little bit weird. But it's gone beyond just the situation that we have at hand. And dare I say, this is going to touch on a wider race conversation that I don't necessarily know if I want to go and touch on right now, but I do believe that it might be at least indirectly connected. Because the former minister has pointed to the fact that the majority of school violence occurred among students from PNM households. This is what the report says. Gatsby-Dolly said during her tenure, the majority of the school violence occurred among students from PNM households. And to what extent is that trying to bring race into this whole issue? So Dr. Hanif Benjamin, he pointed out his disappointment to hear that comment, given the amount of challenges as reported that the school system has faced. And to some extent, I think a lot of this comes back down to the fact that the whole situation, there seemingly was no actual remedy in sight or substantive plan in place by the previous administration. It's almost like if they were content with leaving the situation alone and hoping for the best, because their actions essentially at some point became repetitive and it didn't go any further. We heard reports of students being suspended beyond the guidelines, because at some point after so many suspensions you're supposed to be expelled, but it seemed as though at least in one case that made it to the media, the problem students involved was suspended way more times in excess of the guidelines. And it is in line with one of these students from Southeast Port of Spain who was interviewed, basically saying, yes, the troublemakers get suspended for a couple of days, then they come back and they break the rules the same way, they engage in violence the same way, and it seems like nothing is being done about it. There's no real consequence. If you're willing to beat another student and beat a teacher, do you really care about a 2-day suspension or 1-week suspension? In fact, to some extent, some of these students won't necessarily care about expulsion, but expulsion at that point would not necessarily be a measure of punishment, as pointed out by the students being interviewed and by other stakeholders and commentators. At that point, it's not to remove the student to punish them, it's to remove the student to provide relief to the rest of the school. And Dr. Benjamin points out we must begin to examine from a real sense why the fights are happening. Pay more attention to our home, pay more attention to our communities, pay more attention to our school system as a whole. And to some extent, when he says pay more attention to our home and communities, part of it is, are there any domestic issues? Are there any domestic limitations? With regards to communities, what's going wrong potentially with the communities. Is there a prevalence of gang violence, gang activity in the communities, or any other bad influences? Or is it just a community that lost the village, lost touch, and the students are being left alone too much to their own devices when they're not in school? And they're too accustomed to that, and it's difficult to discipline them when outside of school they're not being disciplined to the same degree, and the inconsistencies are making it very near impossible to get any sort of consistent stability on expectations of social norms on the students. And then, of course, there's the school system itself. Not every teacher in the public school system is a bad teacher, but there are some bad teachers. If you know anybody whose children are in public school, you know that there are some bad teachers. The former Minister of Education is saying that she was speaking from a place of information, not sensationalism. On this basis, I am acutely aware that the PNM has an important role to play, as does the government and civil society organizations, in supporting parents. To this end, providing this type of support through the National Women's League is critical. What does that mean? Because the sad part about it is, if that is true now, why was that not true before? You're in opposition, and now all of a sudden the PNM as a political entity has a part to play. Why didn't it play its part before? And again, with regards to this issue, the NPTA backs the government's stance on school violence because I believe it has become so severe on this whole situation that more extreme measures that were not necessarily or avoided by the previous administration are now unfortunately on the table. I'll never forget, a couple of years ago, one of the callers from Maraval pointed out perhaps this generation is lost, and we need to, I'm paraphrasing, and we need to acknowledge that. I'm paraphrasing, I believe, I don't think he said it this way, but basically to put it in its most straightforward and brutal term, you give up on a generation and you try to help with the later or upcoming generations, because potentially it's too far gone. But I think he was maybe talking about 19, 28, 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds. I don't know if he was speaking about 2020, because this is 23, I believe he made this statement. I don't know if he was speaking about 25, 14, 15-year-olds. And part of it is, with this whole situation, I think, it's a similar issue, like many others. You see, the Auditor General stuff, the SRC stuff, the general crime situation and the low middle detection rate and the arrest of the commissioner, these are obvious issues that a lot of people would speak about and be concerned about, whatever the PNM did. But what about the things that are not as well highlighted that the PNM potentially didn't do? And now we have to bear in mind, we have to hold the current administration, we have to hold them accountable if they make similar errors of omission. Because I feel as though this school violence situation, we kind of know it's a problem, but do we really understand the severity of the problem? And what are we doing to try to deal with the situation? Right now, the TPS is saying that a lack of manpower is their biggest challenge. The community police, in the district. And this is the thing that I want to point out. The police cannot compensate for this issue directly. The issue is potentially born in part by the fact that crime is out of control and is negatively influencing young people, school-age individuals, as young as, older primary school students. But we don't have enough manpower. If we take every police officer, even the protective details, everybody, and we just put them in the schools, we probably still might not have enough manpower to ensure that things don't go off the rails. Or at least if if that solves the problem, we'll be sacrificing too much on the back end with regards to the rest of the country. So this is something that needs to be solved at the education system level. And all right, the opposition leader asked, what's the plan for these students? This might cost us in terms of real dollars, again, with regards to certain programs that probably need better funding and better trained individuals and more personnel. And now, again, at what point did the administration campaign on increasing MILAT, increasing all of these social programs, increasing certain funding for certain measures with regards to youth development and youth rehabilitation? Because the education system itself is to some extent underfunded, right? And that has an indirect effect on this whole situation as well. Let's not forget, right now, junior secondary schools are seen like an academic death sentence for students with any serious academic ambitions. And that, at least as one caller pointed out, was not always the case. So when I say that the administration needs to tell us exactly how they intend to finance everything they promise, that comes with the unstated caveat of there's a lot of unspoken things that are potentially necessary that they didn't even address. So when we say that they promise, we're not even speaking about that. Extra expenses on top of it to deal with situations that are immediate issues that cannot be put on the back burner anymore, because that's the error with regards to those issues that the previous administration did. And if you think it's acceptable for the current administration to do it, well, then I have an issue with that line of thinking. Because we might end up having to sacrifice, I don't know how many generations of students. And at that point, demographically, we might have a demographic hole as bad as Russia or China if we allow that to happen. Because we're taking the development of our young people for granted when we do things like that, if we do things like that. I mean, there was a video of the beating. There were adults in the video. Obviously, there were people taking the video. It was on a public street. There were other pedestrians. I haven't even spoken about all the implications of that. Other media houses have. I'm not going to bother. I am more concerned about what do we expect the solution to be, and are we naive enough to think it's going to be cheap? All right. Let's take a break. When we come back, I'll just switch gears really quick, hit a video, and then maybe ask a pertinent question of what our expectations should be, or rather, what is our processes with how we deal with important events. Stay tuned. It's Document WSN. We'll be right back after this.
Low energy? Heart concerns? Migraines slowing you down? It's time to take control of your health. Join Wellness Unlocked, the series that brings expert advice and real solutions for a healthier you. In our latest episode, learn how Jameson CoQ10 can help support heart health, boost energy, and even reduce migraines. Get the science, the stories, and the steps to power up your health with CoQ10. Don't miss Wellness Unlocked. Watch now on WESN and start your wellness journey today.
Do you need treatment for obesity or any related abdominal procedures? The community hospital now offers minimally invasive laparoscopic surgery done by an American-trained, board-certified surgeon with over 20 years' experience. Give us a call at 235-5479 for more information.
The Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.
course, those of you who keep their eyes and ears open to international news might know, of course, that the current American president, there's a lot of turbulence around his administration, right? It seems as though we are quite fortunate. Our politics seems a lot more stable in comparison. Now, one of the things, of course, is the protests against the ICE agents and the whole push to deport illegal immigrants, which for whatever reason is extremely controversial in America, except I did see one situation where it seemed as though throughout most of the country, Donald Trump's approval ratings hasn't really dipped on this issue, or in general at the very least one poll said. A poll done by a non-conservative media house, by the way. Now, with that said, I haven't necessarily followed the whole story because this is just one of those things where I find it's very politicized, you know, similar to the situation that we hope our education issues don't turn into. And when it's that politicized, then at some point, the two sides of the argument, I find, are not as in good faith as they make themselves out to be. But looking at some of the coverage in the last 24 hours caused me to have some questions with regards to how people interpret certain aspects of the news, what's being told to them, what they think are the current events. And in fact, even our affiliate has to some extent called out, France 24 that is, has to some extent called out on the overestimation or the inciting or making a mountain out of a molehill, this situation in Los Angeles, and potentially kind of spreading sensational news and trying to fact-check the situation and spread the truth, although I would argue in doing so, they run the risk of also over-sensationalizing and overestimating and overdoing things from their point of view as well. So I found an interesting clip where the arguments are a bit more technical with regards to some of the latest decisions being made. This is from another European station, DW News. And the speaker is a former or retired military veteran going into the technicalities of the law with regards to utilizing various branches of the military armed services in situations like this, and why, even if you might agree with certain things, there are other things you might disagree with, as I pointed out with issues this week. Now, to what extent do we go through that exercise ourselves? Before I go any further with that point, let's see what was said on this issue and cue this.
As you mentioned, the event comes amid anti-ICE protests and unrest in LA, and President Trump, as we know, deployed Marines and basically doubled the National Guard without a governor's request for the first time since 1965. So, from your expertise, can the president legally send troops to the cities that basically reject them?
Well, I think in this case, the problem is that, the governor did not ask for the help. And this whole thing is a manufactured crisis. I mean, all the different news agencies that I have watched or reports I've read indicate that what's going on is in a very small part of Los Angeles, which of course is a massive city. I mean, you got 4 million in the city of Los Angeles, and the greater metro area is like 12 million. It's enormous. And so something like this, when the president says it's an invasion, we have to liberate Los Angeles, that is ridiculous. And I think anybody that's using their brain is thinking like, okay, well, that makes no sense. So it's very inflammatory language by the president and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Defense, Homeland Security. They're saying things that are inflammatory, that are trying to justify or create a situation that could be handled, should be handled appropriately by the mayor and the governor. So to jump to this so quickly, that's why this is obviously a manufactured crisis. And the Marines, look, the National Guard is trained to do crowd control, civil disturbances, as well as dealing with fires or earthquakes or floods and other things. they're an asset for the governor. So they have training on how to do those things and the proper equipment. The Marines coming up from Camp Pendleton, these guys are combat forces. Chances of them having trained properly on how to deal with a riot, for example, pretty slim. And it also now creates a situation where potentially these young Marines will be confronted with fellow American citizens in a situation for which they are not properly prepared, and legally they should not be there. So I'm not surprised that the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Navy, who has the civilian authority over the Marine Corps, would have caved to pressure from the administration. I would like to know what the Commandant of the Marine Corps, he's the equivalent to the Chief of the Army, Chief of the Air Force, Chief of the Navy, Commandant of the Marine Corps. Is he confident that this was a legal order to send his Marines into Los Angeles? I don't see how it is, and I don't think the administration has made a case for it. But these are the kind of things that this administration is doing. They're putting senior officers in very difficult positions where maybe it's not entirely clear one way or the other, and it's unnecessary.
Does this set a precedent for future federal crackdowns on protests, or no?
It certainly has the feel of something that's being done where they're trying out different ways to do things, to justify it. And it doesn't help when you do have some protesters that are either flying Mexican flags or they're throwing rocks and they're lighting fires. That feeds the narrative because that gets captured in the news. And people say, look, it's out of control. Governor's not doing it. We got to go in and fix it. So I think that we'll see. The governor of California, I think, is doing the right thing. He's standing up, like defending his prerogatives as governor. And I think for him to sue the administration in court is the right thing to do. Other people need to be speaking out. I'm disappointed that so many members of Congress are sitting on their hands that they're not coming out saying that this is outrageous. Also, I'm disappointed. I haven't seen a lot of retired military speaking up about this as being inappropriate as well.
All right, to make a long story short, this is a complex situation. I'm sure a lot of people will, depending on what media outlets they like to follow, will either be saying Trump is right, or the governor of California is right, et cetera, et cetera. The conservatives are right, or the Democrats are right. In my opinion, to some extent, there's a good amount of blame to be thrown about in this situation on all sides. Some of it is not necessarily blame for anything that has happened yet, but rather maybe it's me anticipating or saying, hey, bad things can happen in this situation because historically I have seen bad things happen in a similar situation. What am I talking about? And this is going to be a controversial statement. I already took my lumps when it happened on social media, well before on WESN, but I ain't afraid to talk about it again from my perspective. During the George Floyd protests, they were rioting. They were rioting where businesses were destroyed. I know this because the examples that I will always remember are not just any random business, but rather businesses owned by African Americans. In one case, it was targeted. They swung back and destroyed it twice and ruined, or rather, yes, financially ruined an African American firefighter who put all his savings into a business. In the other case, it was at least two little old ladies, African Americans, that had a little shoe business, retail business. But I guess, hey, once it's a business, the protests at that time didn't care about the actual racial matters, or at least some of the rioters did not care about the racial matters the protests were going to be about. Why do I bring that up? Well, it's because the leadership at the time was more than willing to turn a blind eye to the protests. And when rioting did engage, the media more or less didn't really want to call that ugly aspect of it out. Because, again, we were so caught up about the George Floyd situation, how dare you speak out about anything else that, technically speaking, does not necessarily has to be connected with the George Floyd situation, because we lack the maturity to actually look at the various aspects of things and judge it on their own merits. Because to some degree, you can understand, indirect things like that, if the winds of change happens in the narrative, it could have actually affected the perception of what happened to George Floyd, which again shows a certain level of immaturity and inability to judge various aspects on their individual merits, which is something that I have brought up with this Venezuelan situation. So I understand why people with conservative backgrounds will look at the potential of these protests getting more extreme, because in the past, extreme left-wing protesters took far too much liberties, and it got to extreme in various cities at the time in 2021 and 2020. Now, and here's the thing, as was pointed out by the speaker, there have been isolated incidents. That's how I would put it. Not widespread incidents of violence and property destruction, but isolated incidents. However, when you start throwing Molotov cocktails, things kind of getting a little too extreme. The key point is, while I understand that you might have national, federal officials concerned that the democratically elected governor, etc., might not necessarily handle these things appropriately, two wrongs don't make a right. And what the speaker in the interview clip said with regards to the use of Marines and the use of the National Guard and the proper procedure to engage with them, these are things that you can't just dismiss out of hand, at least not without good reason. And if it was the case that LA was burning, well, fine. But it's unfortunately, yes, you kind of have to wait on the actual extreme emergency. You can't necessarily step over proper procedure and proper lines of authority because you're afraid of what could happen. That is so extreme, it is not necessarily immediately plausible. Because one of our affiliates, one of the correspondents, he pointed out, similar things happened with regards to when they had the protests in France. So France is burning. He pointed out, Fox News said that, when in reality that wasn't the case. There were protests, but Paris wasn't burning. And the whole part about this is potentially manufacturing a crisis. I don't know if it's manufacturing a crisis as much as if it is kind of jumping the gun on a situation and being too heavy-handed in the approach and giving, to be fair to the governor and to the mayor of LA, giving them ammunition to push back against it. Because the precedent set is not a good one with regards to deploying Marines. National Guardsmen potentially will be a little bit older, and as was said, they will have certain training with regards to natural disasters and dealing with protesters and the like. Marines, you know, the average Marine grunt is going to be generally younger, and all of their training is going to be centered around war fighting, which it goes back to when I kind of caution people saying, why do we want the defense force to just willy-nilly deal with crime? It doesn't automatically work that way. But one of the things that I find telling, and it goes back now to how do we determine the truth? In that same clip on France 24 that I watched, where the speaker was basically also saying this is a manufactured crisis, the Trump administration is going off the rails, they shouldn't be doing this, they shouldn't be doing that. There was a lower third that said increase in arrests by police. So the work that, or the measures that the federal government put in place was not actually affecting the situation as directly as the local law enforcement agencies. BBC has a report on this. Nearly 400 people have been arrested in LA since protests began on Friday, including 330 undocumented migrants and 157 people arrested for assault and obstruction, including one for the attempted murder of a police officer. I'm not saying that LA is going to burn, is likely to burn tomorrow, but let's not kid ourselves that this is a wholly manufactured crisis and there's nothing to see here. Now, to some extent, I believe it's the mayor of LA saying, what the federal government is doing is inciting the protesters. But unfortunately, and I said this about our current government with regards to the promises to the PSA, that was done on the campaign trail. They were voted in campaigning on that issue. To some extent, they can't not follow through with it. It's similar to Donald Trump and the illegal immigration issue, which was downplayed by Democrats, and people want to say, oh, you want to make sanctuary cities the scapegoats. No offense, but they had a part to play in this whole illegal immigration crisis in America. So to me, I'm not necessarily going to look to watch any sort of conservative news outlet, and I'm going to want to see cheerleaders for, oh gosh, Donald Trump is great. And I'm looking at liberal news media, I'm saying, you're potentially just as blind. And what I'm pointing out is to the fact that I will never tell you, listen to me, I know the truth and I know what is right. I will tell you, this is my opinion, and I will encourage you to go through your own exercise. As I have mentioned in the past more than once, see what everyone is saying, go through your own exercise, hopefully work on your media literacy in order to help determine what is pertinent or not, significant or not, likely, probable or not, to help your individual assessment of what you think is happening. Because what I think is happening is not quite what is being reported, I believe, on either side of the equation. And I think a lot of it comes down to a difference of approach, a difference in agendas, and a utilization of incendiary language on both sides to kind of paint the other side to some extent as an enemy. Meanwhile, because of the conflicting approaches, potentially dealing with the actual issues on the ground, which on one hand is not a complete and utter disaster for the city of Los Angeles, but on the other hand, we ain't talking about peaceful protesters singing Kumbaya with candlelights and quietly just showing support for whatever issue they think is necessary. Yes, people might not realize it, but when you are waving foreign flags on a domestic issue, to some extent, that is a symptom of a problem. How you view it is subjective. But at that point, are you pro-Mexican? But this is Mexico. So why does that matter in that sense? Why does Mexican nationalism matter in an American domestic issue? Because that's what it is. Illegal immigrants aren't entitled to anything. It's in the name, illegal immigrants. And I've seen where the media and certain politicians have systemically tried to convince, and successfully so, people, illegal immigrants do nothing wrong. Well, immigration laws are there for a reason, and you remove them at your own peril. Just ask Europe. Poland laughs at the rest of the EU on a regular basis over that. Compassion at times not tempered with practical strategies and irresponsible decisions leads to failed initiatives that end up only harming everybody involved, including not just the people who you're trying to help, but your own citizens who then question your decisions. And that's why illegal immigration is such a popular issue for Trump, regardless of what the media and his political opponents think. And they are only feeding into his excesses. Right, we have a call on the line that's been waiting. I'm sorry, I've been going on too long. We'll take the call. Good morning, caller, you're on here.
Apologies accepted. This is Diego Martin in the house. Good morning. Yeah. I want to shift from American politics. I want to talk about the nomination of the COP.
Yeah.
I have always said the Police Service Commission and Parliament has given us a 6 for 9 with respect to the Commission of Police. There's a new one, and a lot of people are not aware of what he is about.
Right.
What is his qualification? What is the experience? Both inside out, from the police themselves, and from external so-called experts. I want to flesh out some issues I have. I am a stakeholder. I am in sync with the Prime Minister, want to fix it in 6 months. Let me share my own issue on it. This gentleman, I don't know him. I've never met him. I've seen little of him. What I know about him, he is somewhere linked with the special branch.
Oh, he's a member of the special branch.
Right. The special branch provides security detail to the Prime Minister. So he has a part to play with ongoing investigations, right? There is one particular investigation, I've heard nothing about it. The lead driver for the security detail was killed about a year ago. Somewhere in Kearney, they say it was a botched phone. I have not seen anything about that. His qualifications, I've seen on the Facebook and the newspaper some accreditation with a San Salvador, El Salvador institution, which is basically an accredited academy, which is part of the American and the secret, not the Secret Service, the Home Security Service for Latin America and Caribbean. I saw they were giving some courses, 16 weeks courses and things like that. I want to juxtapose that with the qualifications, what the POLC/DPA, Director of Personnel Administration, I believe they are responsible for vetting human resources qualification for this appointment. There is a court case right now where a sergeant who has the distinction of gotten his master's in law with a distinction, and the POLSC did not accept it. Right now it is in the Court of Appeal.
Yes.
I want to juxtapose that with what qualification the gentleman have. The other issue is Karen raised some serious issues yesterday. The Prime Minister raised some serious issues with respect to the Foreign Minister, Amory Brown, with respect to women being exploited. In 2023, Erla Christopher raised an issue that she's going to investigate human trafficking with a high government official. That particular gentleman is in the middle of all of that. Special branch will know and have an idea of what high government officials, particularly ministers. For example, the former youth development minister, there was a big investigation with him. And you know, talking about, I'm not going to call him, but he is the general secretary of the PNM. All of those investigations have not been closed out, and we are not hearing about it. So why are you juxtaposing him into the position of the Commissioner of Police? The last question I'm going to ask about this, was the position advised? Did they use a new merit list, or did they take people from the old merit list? Because I didn't see it. All I know is a merit list was generated, and you have two people on it. One we don't know too much about, the other one we know has been all over the place. That's ACP Meister. I have no problem with him. I know him. I know his track record. The special branch officer, I don't know his track record. And I don't want we to, meaning Trinidad, to choose a commissioner of police will fail and not realize the mandate of our Prime Minister. I go and have a nice morning.
Thank you, caller. Well, here's it. You see, I guess part of the issue with what you're saying, or part of the issue I have with what you're saying, you pointed out yourself, the merit list, right? The media has not had access to a merit list. We don't know who the alternatives are. So to some extent, it's not enough to say, is he good enough? We also have to kind of know who is the alternatives and would they be better? And then part of the issue is we have limited information. I think I have seen different reporting on his current rank. One could be that I think he might be an acting assistant commissioner of police and not an acting senior superintendent, at least in one report. It says he currently holds the rank of assistant commissioner. And I don't believe they're talking about Meister, yes, in this paragraph. So, and they went into some of the investigations he may have been involved with in the special branch, but I don't believe we have any resolutions to a lot of those things. We have a call on WhatsApp, so I'll refrain from, I'll continue on after the call. Good morning, caller, you on there?
Well, you have a caller, not necessarily only on WhatsApp. Good morning to you, sir.
Morning.
Mr. Small.
Yes.
Listening to you this morning, I got a sense that you wanted to embrace the whole world in the time allotted to you. And as good as you are, I think that is a very difficult assignment. That having been said, the issue of local government in a time like this requires a level of coordination by all the local government agencies that will ensure that we have a smooth transition from the floods and the crises to a state of normalcy. I'm hoping that I would see some more calls by the relevant heads of each regional corporation, keeping the public apprised of what is going on, because there's no doubt that the rains of the last 3 days would have impacted on communities across the country. But I'm not hearing that level of reporting. I certainly haven't heard the mayor of Port of Spain say to us precisely whether we have been impacted enough. Let me correct that. Whether we have been impacted. And I certainly would want to know the similar kinds of reports coming out from the chairman of regional corporations as spread across the country.
Thank you, caller. Is that all? Caller? Okay. So I can't find the quotes, but I believe there was something said with regards to the current level of response being welcomed by certain local governments. Right, here it is. And this is with regards to the Penal Debe Regional Corporation. Several water court, let me just get here, right? The Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government launches flood mitigation exercise on May 13th, focus on cleaning, dredging, and clearing of watercourses, right? So it's a very compound exercise. It's a very integrated exercise. It is all supported by every member of parliament, instructed by the Prime Minister. So it has the political will, I call it. I see, this is of course the chairman of Penal Debe. I see it's the major difference. One may ask why this beautiful result did not come earlier and people had to suffer the trauma. Of course, it requires what I call the political will. So to some extent, therein lies the difference. But I would argue it's because we have a limited budget and flood mitigation was not prioritized as much as we would have hoped, based on the results. To what extent this can continue, because this is just one regional corporation out of the 14, right? To hear more from the local government leadership, I would agree with you. I think part of the problem is this, and this is par for the course in our country. Unless you are at the top of the political hierarchy, regardless of what your actual substantial position is, you generally don't speak out too often because you are afraid of making a mistake, of misspeaking, and especially when you're on the lower ranks, of making other people in your party look bad, particularly people above you. And that's what happened to some people on the local government level in the not too distant past. Good work was rewarded by complaints by people who were not as capable. And instead of being rewarded for your good work, or for their good work, or for their initiative, or their attempts to solve problems, they were criticized, cussed out, and discarded. And I won't necessarily go further on who that is, because they themselves might want to remain more in the background. But I've spoken about it before, so those who are consistent viewers of the show for years might know who I'm talking about. So that's why you see when things kind of go bad. Look, there was a reason why Faris got more and more quiet as time went on. Now all of a sudden, with a change in leadership, he needs to reestablish himself. And I would argue that to some extent, the local government corporations, it actually became more complicated now that the UNC is at the forefront. Not necessarily that we've seen the effect of that on their public speaking, but it's just natural. When in opposition, it's more open for them to necessarily say what they have to say. But the flip side of that was the PNM corporations, PNM-led corporations couldn't say a note. So now it's all well and good that we have a good response from the central government, but it all depends on what the priorities with regards to the mid-year budget review and really the upcoming budget. That will, to some extent, signal the leeway they have to talk, because they can't, unless the Prime Minister and Cabinet does it, if there are budget limitations, which then will impact their own flood mitigation efforts, they can't necessarily come right out and say it. When they were in opposition, when the UNC was in opposition, then the UNC corporations had license to point out the fact they weren't getting their full allocation, which was actually even worse, because we already have budget issues, but then on top of the budget limitations, what was allocated was not actually given out. And that compounded the flood problems that we see today. And then when you, on top of that, think of the ministers who were directly responsible for those areas at the time, Rohan Sinanan and Faris Awari, not the most inspiring duo, not the most innovative or enterprising duo with regards to governance and government policy and solution-oriented decision-making. It is what it is. I really hope that ministers like Khadija Amin and Jaylene John, and again, one of the good signs that I mentioned this before, it's not as though they were quiet, then it rained, then they just came out to the woodworks, went in front of a backhoe, spoke to the media, went back in their offices. They were talking about these issues before. When the first rains came down, or even potentially before that. So we're seeing, at least right now, some level of consistency. But it's crazy to me with regards to things like flooding, with regards to things like school violence. Think about these two issues and how, to what extent they were kind of put on the back burner and shelved, willfully ignored. Nothing to see here. If you were directly affected by these issues, it potentially ruined your whole world. But to some extent, to the rest of the country, yes, the media reported on it, and the media can't necessarily commit their whole editorial space and all of their commentary and all of their reporting on just one or two issues. There's too many things to go around. But to what extent is the public really aware? And this, in part, goes to my criticisms of information dissemination in TNT, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. To what extent the media is a part of that problem or does not have the tools to meet with that problem, I don't know. It's partially compounded by the whole new media, old media debate and the fact that a lot of eyeballs are on YouTube channels and online social media, so now with regards to advertising, how do you get mass messaging out there that's necessary and important? It's difficult. And therein, it goes back to what I was trying to say with regards to the foreign video, because the content of what's going on abroad is not the key point. It's how the information is being disseminated and how people are consuming the information. And are you one of those individuals who basically, my side is this station? If you're American, it's conservative or Democrat, so conservative or liberal, sorry. What media house you listen to that is loyal or biased to whatever side is your side. Locally, it's not so clear-cut, but there are instances of media bias or individual biases in media houses. Who do you want to listen to? Do you always want to listen to pro-UNC or pro-PNM coverage? Because when you do that, what you think is not something that you came to conclude of assessing the reality. You might think that you are drawing your own conclusions, but you're not. What you're doing is what you think is what you were told. And there have been times when I've agreed with liberals, and there are times when I agreed with conservatives, and there are times when I agreed with the PNM, and there are times when I agreed with the UNC, but I was not married to that. I was not loyal to that. So what they told me did not automatically become my opinion on whatever matter. It was what I assessed the truth to be. And then in turn, I give my opinion on this show. And I'm not telling you what the truth is and what you should believe. I'm telling you what I think. And every now and then, like today, I'm encouraging you. What do you think about it? What do you think about flooding and flood mitigation and potentially the lack thereof over the last 5 years? What do you think about school violence and the efforts to tamper down school violence, or the lack thereof with the last 5 years? And with regards to those two issues, the measures that are so far being put in place and potentially being proposed for future efforts. What do you think? How important is this to you? And like flooding, I don't have kids. I have younger family members, but I don't have kids. I'm not in a flood-prone area, and I'm saying these are areas where, if necessary, that we have to sacrifice certain government offerings to deal with these things. Something that is not going to benefit me directly, do it. Now, how many people are willing to say that about various issues that do not affect them directly, so the mitigation of it does not directly benefit them? That's what I was trying to get to with the topic of abroad, where rather than trying to assess things for ourselves, we just want to join the team and cheerlead our side, as some media personalities in this country actually do, which I find is borderline irresponsible. Because when we don't critically think for ourselves, engage in these topics in a responsible way, and then try to do something about it within our means, beyond just an election every 5 years, you get the complacency that we've seen on certain issues. And now we have a former Minister of Education trying to say, well, we have a role to play in an issue that has been ongoing for the last couple of years when we were in power. So all of a sudden, now that we have lost the government, we have a role to play as a political institution. What about before? It is the inconsistencies like that that are allowed to happen because we allow it to happen. And now with regards to the Commissioner of Police candidate, again, these things are interconnected because we have an environment where we show complacency and tolerance, and to some extent that could have been why the PNM may not have thought they were going to lose or lose that badly. And then when we get to situations like the Commissioner of Police now, we have all these questions with regards to how could this happen, and is this the right way to do it, and is the process correct? But we need to understand, we've given up so much agency across the board. It's an uphill battle now when we see specific issues that we want to champion and try to turn around, because you're going to want to try and fix it quickly, but it's gonna take a lot of time because we have built in a certain level of a lack of accountability and transparency in governance because we've allowed it to happen. We can't then now just try and flip the script when it suits us because a nation as a conglomerate of millions of individuals does not just move on a dime, turn on a dime just like that with regards to whatever course it's on. There's a certain amount of institutional inertia when organizations reach a certain size that's difficult to fight against. It's not anything nefarious. It literally is just to pull in another direction. Takes a lot of time and effort, much less a country. And it's not enough that when these emergency things happen, all of a sudden we kind of hold our head and say, how did we get here? And we have to do better. When things are going good, we should strive to do better. Not say, hey, why are you fighting up for? Things are okay. Don't study that. It's okay. Let it go. You do that enough, you're complacent enough, you reach where you reach. And then you end up like a situation in America where at some point, the combative nature and the inflexibility of your country is going to come back and do significant actual physical harm. And I said this before, and now I'll go a step further. I've said it before. I used to think foreign first world democratic institutions were things that we looked up to, that we should have strived for. Look how easy it was. Boris Johnson made one tiny mistake and he got kicked out. He made a mistake that was far surpassed by the mistakes our several administrations in recent memory, not just the most recent one, have done far worse, and yet they didn't necessarily have such a severe consequence. However, now we look at foreign democratic institutions and democratic elected processes and governments, and you could argue, A, they have fallen down to our level if you want to go the assumption that we were not as mature as them. And dare I say now that they have actually gone below us. Because like I said, our country ain't that unstable and incendiary, at least not yet. And when I caution people about the level of language we use, hasn't necessarily blown up in the Americans' faces yet, but just wait. We have a similar number of guns, I would argue, on a practical level. Enough for it to be a problem. But let me end the show there. Stay safe with your reins. Remember your allegiance to the Republic and to each other. Be your brother's keeper in times like this. We'll probably speak more about the flooding and flood mitigation with Ashraf tomorrow. Try and have a good day, but keep your fellow citizens in mind, because it's nice to be nice. Be nice to each other so we could see each other tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN.
Low energy? Heart concerns? Migraines slowing you down? It's time to take control of your health. Join Wellness Unlocked, the series that brings expert advice and real solutions for a healthier you. In our latest episode, learn how Jameson CoQ10 can help support heart health, boost energy, and even reduce migraines. Get the science, the stories, and the steps to power up your health with CoQ10. Don't miss Wellness Unlocked. Watch now on WESN and start your wellness journey today.